In a quiet suburban neighborhood where tree-lined streets and manicured lawns gave the illusion of peace, tensions simmered just below the surface. This was a place where racial biases often went unnoticed by those who didn't experience them firsthand. It was here that Special Agent Danielle "Danny" Monroe found herself one sunny afternoon. Danny was no ordinary resident. She was a highly decorated FBI agent, known for her sharp mind, quick thinking, and unwavering dedication to justice. Her latest assignment had brought her undercover to investigate a string of racially motivated incidents plaguing the area. Danny parked her car near a small park surrounded by tall oak trees. The air smelled fresh, and children laughed as they played on swings nearby. She opened her laptop on the passenger seat and began reviewing case files. To anyone passing by, she looked like someone working remotely, a common sight these days. But Danny wasn't just another person enjoying the calm afternoon. She was gathering crucial information that could help solve cases affecting countless lives. Unbeknownst to Danny, Officer Karen Whitmore was patrolling the same neighborhood. Karen had been with the police force for over 2 decades and prided herself on keeping her community safe. However, her definition of safety seemed to exclude certain groups of people. Over the years, she had earned a reputation for targeting minority residents under the guise of routine checks. Many complained about her aggressive tactics, but nothing ever stuck against her record. Today, however, fate had something else in store. As Karen drove past the park, her eyes landed on Danny's car. Something about the scene didn't sit right with her. Maybe it was the color of Danny's skin, or the fact that this wasn't a neighborhood she thought someone like Danny belonged in. Whatever it was, Karen decided to act. Pulling up behind Danny's vehicle, she stepped out of her patrol car, her boots clicking against the pavement. With a stern expression, she approached Danny's window. "Good afternoon," Danny said politely when she noticed Karen standing there. She kept her tone calm and professional, not wanting to draw unnecessary attention. But Karen wasn't interested in pleasantries. "License and registration," Karen demanded abruptly, her voice sharp. Danny blinked, taken aback. "Is there a problem, officer?" she asked, genuinely confused. "You're parked here for a long time," Karen replied, folding her arms across her chest. "This is a residential area. People have reported suspicious activity." Danny glanced around. Families were walking their dogs. Kids were playing. It hardly seemed like a hotbed of crime. Still, she reached for her wallet to comply, deciding it was easier to defuse the situation than escalate it. Little did she know, this encounter would spiral far beyond a simple traffic stop. What started as an ordinary day was about to take a turn that neither woman could have predicted. Karen's tone grew sharper with each passing second, her body language radiating hostility. Danny, still seated in her car, tried to remain calm and composed despite the tension brewing around her. She handed over her license and registration as requested, all while maintaining a polite demeanor. "I'm just working here," Danny explained gently, gesturing toward her laptop. "I didn't realize parking here would be an issue." But Karen wasn't listening. Her eyes scanned Danny's documents, though it was clear she wasn't focused on the details. Instead, her mind seemed to be racing with assumptions rooted not in facts, but in stereotypes that had festered within her for years. After a brief pause, Karen looked up, her expression hardening even further. "This is a nice neighborhood," she said pointedly. "Do you live around here?" Danny hesitated for a moment, unsure of how to respond. Revealing too much about herself might blow her cover, jeopardizing the investigation she was working on. At the same time, lying could escalate the situation unnecessarily. Choosing her words carefully, she replied, "I'm visiting someone nearby." Karen raised an eyebrow, clearly unconvinced. "Visiting who?" she pressed, her voice dripping with skepticism. Danny felt a flicker of frustration but pushed it aside. She reminded herself that reacting emotionally wouldn't help. "A friend," she answered simply, keeping her tone neutral. The officer stared at her for what felt like an eternity before shaking her head dismissively. "You don't look like you belong here," Karen muttered under her breath, though loud enough for Danny to hear. The comment stung, but Danny refused to let it show. She knew this wasn't about her personally. It was about the color of her skin and the biases Karen carried. When Danny asked why she was being questioned so intensely, Karen shot back defensively. "There have been complaints about suspicious individuals in this area," she snapped. "And you matched the description." "What description?" Danny asked calmly, though inside, she bristled at the vagueness of the accusation. Karen avoided answering directly, instead leaning closer to peer into Danny's car. Her gaze lingered on the laptop, then shifted to the phone sitting beside it. Every movement felt invasive, every question loaded with suspicion. "I'll need you to step out of the vehicle," Karen instructed abruptly, gripping the handle of her baton. Danny sighed inwardly, realizing this wasn't going to end quickly. Though she wanted to protest, she knew compliance was key. For now. Slowly, she stepped out of the car, her hands visible to show she posed no threat. As Karen continued to interrogate her, Danny subtly reached for her phone, activating its recording feature without drawing attention. She knew how important it was to document everything, not just for her own protection, but also to shed light on situations like this one. People needed to see what happened when bias overrode logic, especially when it came from someone in a position of authority. The confrontation drew curious glances from passersby. A jogger slowed down to watch, while a mother pushing a stroller paused momentarily before moving along. Each new observer added pressure to the situation, making Karen increasingly agitated. Her questions became more aggressive, her tone more accusatory. But Danny stood firm, her composure unshaken. Little did Karen know, the woman standing before her wasn't just any civilian. She was someone who understood the system better than most. And soon, Karen would learn exactly who she was dealing with. Karen's frustration reached a boiling point as Danny continued to answer her questions calmly and confidently. To Karen, it felt like defiance, even though Danny was simply being respectful and cooperative. The more Danny stood her ground, the angrier Karen became. Her voice grew louder, her words sharper, until she finally barked. "That's it. You're under arrest for obstruction of justice." Danny's heart sank, but she didn't let her emotions show. She had been in tough situations before, and she knew losing control now would only make things worse. Still, she couldn't believe what was happening. Arresting someone without probable cause wasn't just wrong, it was illegal. But arguing with Karen wouldn't help. Instead, Danny decided to play along while gathering evidence that could expose the truth later. As Karen began reciting Miranda rights, Danny interrupted politely. "Officer, I'm not resisting. Can you please explain why I'm being arrested?" she asked, her tone measured but firm. Karen ignored the question and tightened handcuffs around Danny's wrists. "You'll have plenty of time to talk at the station," she said curtly, yanking Danny toward the patrol car. Onlookers gasped, some stepping closer to see what was unfolding. One man pulled out his phone and started recording, capturing every moment of the heated exchange. Others whispered among themselves, their faces filled with confusion and disbelief. Once inside the patrol car, Danny took a deep breath, reminding herself to stay focused. She glanced outside and noticed several people filming the scene. A teenage girl held up her phone, tears streaming down her face as she muttered, "This isn't right." Danny locked eyes with her briefly, offering a small nod of reassurance. Even though she was the one in handcuffs, Danny wanted to send a message. This wasn't over. Back at the police station, Danny waited patiently in a holding area while officers processed her paperwork. Despite the weight of the situation, she remained composed, her mind racing with strategies. She knew revealing her true identity too soon might jeopardize her investigation, so she chose her next move carefully. When given the chance to use a phone, Danny dialed a number from memory, speaking in coded language disguised as casual conversation. "Hey, it's me," she said calmly. "I hit a snag, but everything's fine. Just need backup." On the other end of the line, her FBI supervisor immediately understood the urgency. Within minutes, agents were mobilized, ready to step in if needed. Meanwhile, footage of Danny's arrest spread like wildfire online. Videos captured by witnesses showcased Karen's aggressive behavior and Danny's calm demeanor, sparking outrage across social media platforms. Hashtags like #JusticeForDanny began trending, drawing attention from news outlets nationwide. As Danny sat quietly in the holding cell, she couldn't help but feel a sense of purpose. What started as an unjust arrest was quickly becoming something bigger, a spotlight on systemic racism and abuse of power within law enforcement. Though she hadn't planned for this turn of events, Danny realized it might be the opportunity she needed to create real change. For now, all she could do was wait and trust that her team would handle the rest. Within hours, the video of Danny's arrest went viral, spreading like wildfire across social media platforms. People were outraged, not just because of what they saw, but because it felt all too familiar. The footage showed Karen's aggressive tone, her dismissive attitude, and Danny's calm yet firm responses. Viewers couldn't help but notice how quickly the situation escalated without any valid reason. Comments poured in from every corner of the internet, with many pointing out the stark contrast between Danny's composed demeanor and Karen's unprofessional behavior. The story didn't stop online. National news outlets picked up on the incident, airing clips of the arrest during their evening broadcasts. Reporters highlighted the growing tension surrounding racial profiling in law enforcement, using Danny's case as a prime example. Headlines like "FBI agent wrongfully arrested" and "racial bias in policing under scrutiny" dominated newspapers and websites. Protesters began gathering outside the police department, where Karen worked, holding signs that read "No justice, no peace, and end systemic racism now." Danny, still held at the station, became aware of the public outcry when one of the officers muttered under his breath about all this attention. Though she wasn't allowed access to her phone or updates, she could sense the shift in energy around her. Officers who had initially ignored her now glanced in her direction with unease, whispering among themselves. It was clear that the situation had spiraled far beyond what anyone had anticipated. Meanwhile, Danny's FBI team sprang into action behind the scenes. They knew this wasn't just about one officer making a bad call. It was about exposing a pattern of misconduct that had gone unchecked for years. Agents combed through records, pulling together evidence of similar complaints filed against Karen and other officers in her department. What they uncovered was staggering. Reports of racial profiling, falsified documents, and even cases of excessive force, all swept under the rug by internal investigations that lacked accountability. As the hours passed, Danny was finally released pending further investigation. Stepping out of the station, she was met with a sea of cameras and microphones thrust in her face. Reporters shouted questions, eager for her side of the story. But Danny remained silent, knowing that speaking too soon might jeopardize the larger mission. Instead, she offered a small smile, a quiet acknowledgement of the support pouring in from strangers who believed in justice. That night, Danny sat alone in her temporary apartment, scrolling through messages of encouragement from people she'd never met. Some shared their own stories of being targeted because of their race, while others thanked her for standing strong in the face of injustice. Each message fueled her determination to see this through, not just for herself, but for everyone who had ever felt powerless against systemic bias. The next morning, protests grew larger, with crowds spilling into nearby streets. Community leaders joined the demonstrations, calling for transparency and reform within the police department. Danny watched the news coverage, her heart swelling with hope. She realized that her arrest had become more than a personal ordeal. It had ignited a movement. And though she couldn't predict what would happen next, one thing was certain. The world was watching, and change felt closer than ever before. The police department scrambled to contain the growing backlash, calling an emergency press conference to address the public outcry. The room was packed with reporters, their cameras flashing like strobe lights as they awaited answers. Officer Karen Whitmore sat stiffly at a long table alongside the police chief, her face pale but defiant. She clutched a bottle of water, gripping it so tightly that her knuckles turned white. The chief began speaking first, his voice steady but tinged with nervousness. "We are committed to transparency and fairness," he said, though his words felt hollow to those who had seen the video of Danny's arrest. He praised Karen's years of service, attempting to paint her actions as a misunderstanding rather than misconduct. But before he could continue, the doors at the back of the room swung open dramatically. Every head turned as Special Agent Danielle Monroe walked in, flanked by two high-ranking FBI officials. The room fell silent, the tension thick enough to cut with a knife. Danny stepped up to the podium without hesitation, her presence commanding attention. Dressed in a sharp suit and wearing her badge proudly around her neck, she exuded confidence and authority. For a moment, she simply looked out at the crowd, letting the weight of her appearance sink in. Then, in a clear and steady voice, she introduced herself, not as a victim, but as a federal agent dedicated to protecting justice. "What happened to me wasn't an isolated incident," Danny began, her tone firm but measured. "It was the result of systemic racism that has plagued law enforcement for far too long." She recounted the events leading up to her arrest, describing how Karen had targeted her based on nothing more than the color of her skin. Her words were powerful yet restrained, painting a vivid picture of what it felt like to be profiled and humiliated despite holding a position of authority. As Danny spoke, she presented evidence: body cam footage from Karen's patrol car, witness testimonies, and internal documents showing a pattern of discriminatory behavior within the department. Each piece of evidence hit like a hammer, dismantling the police chief's attempts to downplay the situation. Danny didn't stop there. She shared stories from other victims who had been wrongfully targeted, giving them a platform to be heard. When she finished, the room erupted into chaos. Reporters shouted questions, some applauding Danny's bravery while others demanded immediate action from the police department. Karen sat frozen, her face flushed with embarrassment and anger. The chief tried to regain control of the situation, but it was clear that the damage had been done. Danny's reveal had flipped the narrative entirely, exposing not just Karen's actions, but the deeply rooted biases within the system itself. As Danny stepped away from the podium, she locked eyes with Karen for a brief moment. There was no malice in Danny's gaze, only resolve. This wasn't about revenge. It was about accountability. By stepping forward, Danny had transformed a personal injustice into a catalyst for change. And as she left the room, surrounded by supporters and colleagues, she knew this was only the beginning. The fight for justice was far from over, but for the first time in a long time, it felt like the world was finally listening. In the days following the explosive press conference, the Department of Justice announced a formal investigation into the police department where Karen worked. It was clear that Danny's case had opened the floodgates, prompting a deeper look into years of unchecked misconduct. Investigators combed through files, pulling out complaint after complaint filed by residents who claimed they had been unfairly targeted because of their race. Each document painted a disturbing picture of a culture steeped in bias and impunity. The investigation uncovered shocking details. Internal affairs reports revealed that Karen had faced multiple allegations of racial profiling over the years, yet none had resulted in serious consequences. In fact, many complaints had been dismissed outright or buried under vague justifications, like lack of evidence. Worse still, Karen wasn't alone. Several other officers were implicated in similar patterns of behavior. The team found instances of falsified reports, excessive use of force, and even cases where evidence had been manipulated to justify arrests. It became painfully obvious that the problem went far beyond one bad officer. It was systemic. Meanwhile, Danny threw herself into advocating for reform. She partnered with civil rights organizations to push for sweeping changes within law enforcement agencies nationwide. Together, they drafted proposals aimed at increasing transparency, such as requiring body cameras for all officers and implementing stricter oversight mechanisms. Danny also called for mandatory training programs focused on recognizing implicit bias and de-escalation techniques. Her goal wasn't just to punish wrongdoing, but to prevent it from happening again. Public support continued to grow, fueled by widespread media coverage and grassroots activism. Protesters marched through city streets, chanting slogans demanding justice and accountability. Social media campaigns amplified voices that had long been ignored, drawing attention to stories of discrimination and abuse. Schools held discussions about systemic racism, while community leaders organized town halls to brainstorm solutions. Danny attended several of these events, using her platform to inspire others to take action. Behind the scenes, Danny worked tirelessly with her FBI colleagues to ensure the investigation remained thorough and unbiased. They collaborated with prosecutors to build strong cases against not only Karen but also others involved in perpetuating the toxic environment within the department. Every step forward was met with resistance from those who feared change, but Danny refused to back down. She knew the road ahead would be challenging, but she also knew the stakes were too high to give up. As weeks turned into months, the pressure mounted. Calls for resignations echoed across news headlines, and politicians began drafting legislation aimed at holding law enforcement accountable. The ripple effect of Danny's courage spread far beyond her own case. It sparked a national conversation about fairness, equality, and trust in institutions meant to protect everyone equally. For Danny, this was more than vindication. It was validation that speaking truth to power could ignite meaningful transformation. Though the battle was far from over, she felt hopeful knowing she had ignited a spark that couldn't be extinguished. Months after Danny's arrest, the courtroom buzzed with anticipation as Officer Karen Whitmore's trial finally began. The case had captured national attention, drawing reporters, activists, and ordinary citizens eager to witness history unfold. Every seat was filled, and cameras lined the walls, capturing every moment of what many were calling the trial of the decade. For Danny, this wasn't just about seeking justice for herself. It was about holding a mirror up to society and forcing it to confront uncomfortable truths. As the proceedings got underway, prosecutors laid out their case with precision, presenting overwhelming evidence of Karen's misconduct. They showed video footage of the arrest, highlighting her aggressive tone and baseless accusations. Witness testimonies followed, including accounts from bystanders who had filmed the incident and residents who had previously filed complaints against Karen. Each story painted a damning picture of an officer who abused her power and targeted people based on race. When it was Danny's turn to take the stand, the room fell silent. All eyes were on her as she walked confidently to the witness box, her badge glinting under the courtroom lights. She recounted the events of that day in vivid detail, explaining how she had been treated not as a fellow law enforcement officer, but as someone deemed unworthy of respect simply because of the color of her skin. Her voice remained steady, even when recounting the humiliation of being handcuffed and placed in a patrol car. "I've dedicated my life to protecting others," Danny said, looking directly at Karen. "But that day, I wasn't seen as someone sworn to serve. I was seen as a threat. And that's not just wrong. It's dangerous." The jury listened intently, visibly moved by her testimony. Prosecutors emphasized how Karen's actions weren't isolated. They were part of a broader pattern of discriminatory behavior documented over years. Defense attorneys tried to argue that Karen had merely been doing her job, but their claims rang hollow in the face of irrefutable evidence. Even the police chief took the stand, reluctantly admitting during cross-examination that internal investigations had failed to hold officers accountable in the past. After weeks of intense deliberation, the verdict came down. Guilty on all counts. The courtroom erupted in cheers as the judge sentenced Karen to prison time, ordering her to undergo mandatory bias training and forfeit her pension. It was a landmark ruling, one that sent shockwaves through law enforcement communities nationwide. Officers who had once operated with impunity now faced scrutiny, knowing they could no longer hide behind badges to justify prejudice. Outside the courthouse, crowds gathered to celebrate the victory. Protest signs read "Justice prevails" and "Accountability starts here." Danny stood quietly among them, overwhelmed by the support she had received. Reporters clamored for interviews, but she kept her remarks brief. "This isn't the end," she told them. "It's a new beginning. Real change takes time, effort, and courage. Today we took one step forward, but there are many more steps ahead." For Donnie, the trial wasn't just about punishing Karen. It was about exposing a flawed system and demanding better. As she walked away from the courthouse, surrounded by allies and advocates, she felt a renewed sense of purpose. The fight wasn't over, but for the first time, it felt like the scales of justice were starting to tip in the right direction.